After I finished Holly at Hogwarts, the only thing my daughter said was, "Write more." And so thus was born Holly at Hogwarts and the Potions Contest. And here it is. Chapter 1. No! I said no! And I mean no! But Dad, I want to go back! Vernon was in his bedroom looking at his video game, trying hard to not listen to the argument going on outside. That wasn't easy to do, as they were so loud. His sister Holly and his dad were arguing about school again. "That school isn't safe and you are not returning to it," continued his dad angrily. The school in question was something called Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Everyone who attended it was supposed to be a witch or a wizard of some kind. Holly claimed to be an empath. She said she could feel other people's pain and emotions, which qualified her for admissions to the school. Vernon didn't officially know that. His parents had never explained it to him, but Holly had written him a letter telling him all about the place last spring. Vernon wasn't sure he believed all that witchy stuff, but he had to admit Holly seemed to know when he was lying or up to something he shouldn't be doing. Last summer, the next-door neighbor had been dying of cancer. Holly said she had apparently felt the whole thing. She had gotten so sick herself she had nearly died. None of the doctors could figure out what was wrong. Dad finally contacted a cousin of his named Harry Potter for help. Vernon hadn't even known Dad had any cousins. Cousin Harry was supposed to be a wizard, though Vernon had never seen him hold a wand, let alone cast a spell. Cousin Harry had taken Holly to some special doctors who figured out what was wrong with her and made her better almost overnight. Holly had barely returned home when Cousin Harry whisked her away to this Hogwarts school so she could learn how to handle all the outside emotions she was feeling. "But Dad," protested Holly, "it's perfectly safe." "Don't tell me that, young lady. You almost got killed there last year." The school had apparently worked. Holly could now handle outside emotions, and she looked as healthy as a horse. But something must have happened to make Dad feel otherwise. Vernon wasn't sure what. Holly never had a chance to explain, and given the way Dad felt about the whole topic, Vernon decided it was unwise to ask his parents for further explanation. "But that's all been taken care of," insisted Holly. "It won't happen again." "That doesn't matter," Dad retorted. "You're not going." "But all my friends are there," added Holly desperately. "You can make some new friends." "I don't want new friends," complained Holly. "It won't be the same." "You'll manage," replied Dad curtly. "But I don't want to go back to Puddinghampton School," protested Holly. "I don't like it there." "Then we'll find some other school, but it won't be that place." "Dad," began Holly, trying a different tactic, "attending school costs lots of money. There's all the new clothes. I'll need books, school supplies, boarding school costs, even more. If you were to send me back, it wouldn't cost a thing. Cousin Harry said—" Oops. Holly knew better than to mention the school's name, but she shouldn't have mentioned Cousin Harry's name either. Dad had this thing about Cousin Harry. "Have you been talking to Harry behind my back?" Dad practically screamed. "Is he in on this with you?" "No, Dad, no," repeated Holly aghast. "I haven't seen nor heard from him since we left the station. Honest." That had been a memorable event. Vernon had gone with his parents to King Cross Station to pick up Holly at the end of the school year. Mom and Dad hadn't mentioned a word to Vernon about whatever happened at the school that almost cost Holly's life. Neither had said much of anything to Vernon after his return from Smeltings. They had gotten to the station and readily found Cousin Harry and Holly waiting for them. Holly had quickly left Harry's side and ran up to greet her parents. The four returned to Cousin Harry to get the bags. Cousin Harry hadn't even said a word before Dad spoke up. "This is it, Harry," he said bluntly. "We're finished." And if looks could kill, Dad would probably be in prison right now, considering that murderous look he gave Harry. "Holly won't be returning to that school. I don't want to see you ever again." "Now, Dylan," began Mum apologetically, clearly embarrassed by Dad's rude behavior. "You don't really mean that," but Dad cut her off. "Yes, I do," he replied belligerently, still glaring at Harry. Then he moved aggressively forward, planting his big, portly body directly between Cousin Harry and his family, and bluntly added, "Don't you or any of your lot ever bother us again." Cousin Harry had stiffened at the hateful words. His slender frame stretched almost a head higher than Dad, and his hands clenched into a tight fist. For a moment, Vernon thought Harry would argue back, but he didn't. Instead, he met that angry gaze squarely. Then he exhaled. Cousin Harry's body seemed to relax a bit, and he spoke to Dad in a low, quiet voice. "As you wish," was all he said. And then he looked over Dad's shoulder at the rest of the family. "Good day, Mrs. Wycliffe, Vernon, Holly. Have a nice summer." And Cousin Harry had walked away, vanishing swiftly among the crowd of people at the station. That should have been the end of things. But it wasn't. Holly, it seemed, really wanted to go back to Hogwarts. Their first argument happened in the car on the way home. It had ended with Holly grounded in her room that night. The next day, Holly was at it again on Dad's case about returning to Hogwarts. That earned her a week in her room, but that didn't stop Holly. She tried shouting, pleading, crying, begging, threats, promises, all to no avail. Dad was adamant she not return to that school, and all her efforts only made him more resolute. For his part, Dad had tried yells, shouts, grounding, additional chores, none of which seemed to lessen Holly's determination to get into Hogwarts. Holly had accepted and completed every punishment without complaint, returning for more as she tried new ways to get permission. Dad had finally locked up her cat in the garage, away from Holly as a consequence. The cat had not protested at being put in the carrier. Then it glowered, yowling loudly and constantly, until Dad told Holly to tell it to stop. Just like that, the cat had stopped crying and had become as silent as a ghost, but it still glowered at anyone who came near. But the cat's confinement hadn't stopped Holly. Vernon and Mum had kept completely out of the argument, sensing that their interference on either side would only make things worse. But it hadn't been easy. When Holly and Dad weren't exchanging words, the tension in the house was so thick that any stray sound or action could set things off again. When things got really bad, Vernon would hide out in his bedroom, and Mum usually clattered around the kitchen waiting for it all to end. "This is not a matter of money," Dad shouted at Holly. "There is no way I would ever send you back to that place, no matter how much money someone offered me. This matter is closed, and I don't want you to bring it up ever again. Do you understand me?" "But," Holly began. "And if you say one more word about that place, I will take away that belt you got from your mother and whatever you have tied to it." "Belt? What belt?" This was the first time Vernon had heard about a belt. Vernon looked up and out his door in time to see Holly in the other room go white as a sheet at the mention of the belt. She shut her mouth and stormed outside, slamming the door behind her. Dad stomped off to his room, slamming its door behind him. Vernon shut off his video game and quietly headed outside. He found Holly where she always was after these arguments, sitting outside, leaning up against the garage wall. Vernon squatted down next to Holly. "Nice try, sis," he said conciliatorily. "Maybe you'll have better luck next year." "This isn't over yet," Holly said darkly. "There's got to be some way to get him to agree." "Why?" asked Vernon. Sure, he liked Smeltings, but he couldn't imagine going to the kind of lengths Holly was going just to continue attending it. Holly shrugged. "I belong there," she said simply. Holly didn't really understand why it had suddenly become so important to return to Hogwarts, but it had. Maybe it was because of the arbitrary way Dad had made the decision without consulting her first, without even giving her a chance to say goodbye to her friends. Holly leaned up against the wall and hugged her legs, tucking her knees tightly under her chin. Her long blonde hair blew gently in the wind. "What's this all about, a belt?" inquired Vernon. He looked at her critically, searching for some belt she might be wearing, but could see none. It must be under her clothes somewhere. How had Dad known about it? Holly shook her head. "Another time," she said, still clearly upset by the topic. She gripped herself tighter, flattening herself as close as possible to the wall. "How is she?" asked Vernon, changing the subject. "Lonely," replied Holly. They were talking about her cat, Sasha. Holly had seated herself on the side of the wall opposite from where her cat was, inside. That was the only way she could be close to her cat. Holly had some sort of emotional tie with that cat. Though she was forbidden to enter the garage or try to visit the cat, Holly always knew the place outside the garage that was closest to her cat. Holly had never had a cat until Hogwarts. They all thought she was allergic to cats, but she wasn't. The neighbors were. When Holly returned home from the holidays last December, the two, Holly and Sasha, were nearly inseparable. It had fallen upon Vernon to take care of Sasha after she was banned to the garage. He didn't know how to care for a cat. But that didn't really matter. Holly told him what to do and when. She always knew when Sasha was hungry or needed its water changed or litter box cleaned. "Do you suppose you could go in and sit with her for a while?" Holly asked Vernon. "Pet her a bit?" Sure, I guess," replied Vernon. He had nothing better to do. Cat sitting was not his bag, but Sasha did seem to like being petted, and it made Holly a bit happier. "Thanks." Vernon got up and went around to the back garage door. After that, the loud arguments stopped, but the tension remained. Holly didn't say a word about going back to Hogwarts, but Dad seemed to realize that she hadn't given up on the idea. The two never spoke to each other. Holly barely spoke to anyone, and Dad glowered at everyone while waiting for Holly's next move. Vernon spent much of his time with the cat. Last summer he had hung out with Ben, his neighbor. They had gone to the shopping centers to hang out and trade video games. The two had supplemented their allowances by catching stray cats and selling them to the cat man down the street. Unknown to Vernon, the cat man apparently sold the cats to people who used them to train dogs for dog fights. During the holidays, Mum had found out about Vernon selling the cats and forbid him from doing it any more. Holly, no longer sickly and with a cat of her own, had turned into something of a cat fanatic. When she learned about the cat man, Holly had taken Vernon on a midnight trip to the cat man's house and set all the cats free. Vernon didn't dare hang out with Ben anymore. Ben still caught cats. Without the extra income, Vernon figured there was no point in hanging around the shopping centers either. Vernon wasn't really surprised when Mum mentioned one day that she'd heard the guy in the corner had reported a second break-in, and his things had been vandalized. Most likely cages crushed beyond repair. Holly had obviously been busy again. One morning, Mum got a call from Vernon's grandparents, Mr. and Mrs. Wycliffe. They planned to stop by to visit for a while. Mum immediately drove Holly off to the beauty parlor for a haircut. Last December, Holly had told Vernon that while she was at Hogwarts, she learned that she looked a lot like Grandmum Wycliffe's late sister, Lily, Cousin Harry's mum. Unfortunately, Grandmum didn't like her sister. So Holly had cut her long blonde hair to make herself look different, rather than risk losing her grandmum's affection. Vernon thought getting a haircut rather extreme. Of course Grandmum knew Holly wasn't Lily, but Holly was adamant about changing it last December and again this summer. Holly looked radically different when she returned from the parlor with short curly hair and bangs. Dad saw the new hairstyle and glowered the whole evening. Vernon wasn't sure whether he hated the actual haircut or the reason Holly had gotten it cut. Grandmum and Granddad arrived in time for lunch the next day. Grandmum, Violet Wycliffe, was thin and bony with a long neck. Granddad, Vincent Wycliffe, was seriously overweight. He kind of waddled when he moved. The pair of them reminded Vernon of the old nursery rhyme, "Jack Spat could eat no fat, and his wife could eat no lean," only in reverse. "It'll be a short visit," informed Grandmum as she lovingly hugged and kissed her two grandchildren. "Why?" asked Holly. "We're off on our summer vacation," she replied, as they settled into the living room chairs, relaxing after their drive. "Where are you off to this year?" asked Vernon. "We're going on a castle tour," said Granddad cheerfully. Vernon and Holly looked at each other. Vernon had seen the snow globe Holly had of her school, which was definitely a castle of some sort. "How did you decide on that?" inquired Holly. "Your grandmum won free admission to Windsor Castle and an autographed photo of the Queen herself," stated Granddad proudly. Grandmum liked to enter contests, and sometimes she actually won things. Last year, they had won a round-the-world cruise trip. "I wrote how much I loved our Queen in 50 words or less," added Grandmum, "and I won. So we decided that as long as we were visiting one castle, we might as well visit some more," continued Granddad. "Did you know that there are at least 24 other castles in the same area as Windsor Castle?" informed Grandmum. "That should keep us busy for a while. Plus," added Granddad, "there are castles you can actually sleep in as hotels, and others that are supposed to serve fancy meals. I'm not too sure about sleeping in a castle, though," he said it as an aside. "They sound pretty cold and drafty, but the fancy meals sound good. Being fairly hefty, of course the extra food would sound pretty good to him." After lunch, Grandmum and Granddad pulled out the maps and brochures to share with the family. Holly and Vernon helped them pick the castle and plot their route. "What's this?" asked Holly, holding up a separate list of castles she found amongst the brochures. "That's a list of castles we don't want to visit," explained Grandmum. Oh, why? Because they're supposed to be haunted, she replied. It's not that we believe in any of that stuff, but I don't want to listen to all those ghostly stories that are bound to come with a haunted castle. But Windsor Castle is on that list. I know, sighed Grandmum. I've been having second thoughts about visiting there because of that. That castle comes with free admission, so I suppose we should probably go. I assured Vi here that our queen would never live in a haunted place, said Granddad, so it's probably just a bunch of hype to bring in more tourists. Besides, he added, we won't be sleeping there, and that's when the ghosts, if there were such a thing as ghosts, come out anyway, so we've nothing to worry about. Both grandparents happily discussed their travel plans with the family at dinner. And don't you worry, Annie, said Grandmum, reaching out a bony hand and lovingly patting Holly. We'll take lots of movies for you. Holly smiled. I'll look forward to watching them, she said, and happily squeezed Grandmum's hand back. Vernon gave a silent groan and made a mental note to get and set aside several game cartridges for use later on. Last December, his grandparents had entertained the family with over 6 hours of bad home videos of their cruise around the world. Holly had not only watched all the videos, but actually enjoyed them. When they finished discussing the castle plans, the grandparents turned their attention to general visiting and local news. After 2 days, Grandmum Wycliffe had noticed that all was not quite right in the Wycliffe household. Vernon heard her question his mum that morning while they were finishing up their morning tea. In particular, Grandmum was asking about Holly and Dad. Vernon knew his mum wouldn't admit to anything, so he immediately hid out in the garage with a cat, to avoid being questioned next. Unable to get any answers indirectly, Grandmum decided to take her concerns to the source. She chose dinner that night to spring her questions, when nobody could escape. I haven't seen you all day, Holly, began Grandmum. Holly didn't answer, busying herself instead with another bite of food. She was probably hiding out too, thought Vernon. I know something must be wrong, dear, she continued. You've been so silent. Come on, Grandmum wheedled. You're among family. You can tell us. Whatever is wrong, your Grandmum and Granddad can help make it right, assured Granddad, taking another bite of mashed potato and gravy. That's what we're here for. Holly's face reddened. She kept her face down, not answering, and continued to eat. Leave her be, said Dad irritably. Nonsense, disagreed Grandmum, scooping up another helping of beans onto her plate. Now is a perfect time to air out problems. Everyone's here, and we can discuss things sensibly. So tell us, Holly, sweetie, what's wrong? Holly continued to eat, saying nothing. Holly, said Granddad, annoyed. He put down his fork and looked at Holly sternly. Your Grandmum asked you a question. You need to answer it. Mum, Dad, protested Dad. This is none of your business. Leave it be. Yes, it is, argued Granddad, now angry. She's being rude, Dylan, and I won't stand for it. Holly, he ordered, answer your Grandmum. Holly froze in place but didn't answer. Now, insisted Granddad. Holly's hand trembled. Then she looked up and blurted, I want to go back to Aunt Hillary's private finishing school for young ladies. Everyone stared at Holly. Holly quickly looked down, loaded her fork with more food, and shoveled it into her mouth. Aunt Hillary's private finishing school for young ladies was actually Hogwarts. Apparently, Grandmum and Granddad didn't like Hogwarts, so, rather than risk a big argument, Dad never told them the name of the school Holly attended last year. He told them, instead, that Holly was attending Aunt Hillary's private finishing school for young ladies. But of course you are, sweetie, assured Grandmum. Who said you weren't? Mrs. Wycliffe, began Mum, I hardly think Holly's education is any business of yours. She's my granddaughter. Of course I have an interest in her future, argued Grandmum. And having successfully raised one wonderful son, she looked lovingly over at Dylan, I have experience in these matters. I've said it before and will say it again. You and Dylan have been way too overprotective of Holly. You finally took my advice and sent her off to a proper boarding school. Holly has positively blossomed this last year. Don't undo the good you've done by changing schools or making her stay home again. She looked again at Dad. Now, she said, getting down to business, did you tell her she couldn't go back to Aunt Hillary's? Yes, he mumbled. That doesn't make any sense, said Granddad. You said yourself that Aunt Hillary's was a fine establishment when you told us about it last year. I changed my mind, muttered Dad, clearly uncomfortable. But why? Protested Grandmum. Look at Holly. She's never looked better in her life." Holly's face was still down, and her fork stirred her food about aimlessly, having obviously given up trying to actually eat. "It's not safe," Dad mumbled, looking down as well, unable to meet his parents' inquiring looks. "You're kidding," said Grandmom in disbelief. "Of course it's safe." Then her eyes narrowed suspiciously as she looked at Dad. "Did something happen last year to make you feel differently? What didn't you tell us?" Holly and Dad looked at each other uncomfortably without saying anything. "Something tells me that this has less to do about safety and more about the empty nest back home," continued Grandmom knowingly, without really waiting for an answer. "I know how much you love Holly Dillon. You must miss her terribly when she's at school. Our lives were pretty lonely once you went off to school. I wanted you to stay with us, dear, but sometimes you have to think of what's best for the child, not the parent." "It's not that," protested Dad. "Then it's the money," interrupted Granddad. "You know it was pretty expensive putting you through school, Dillon, and you have to pay for it too. We'd be happy to help out." "It's not the money," exploded Dad. "Well, what then?" Both Grandmom and Granddad looked at Dad expectantly. Dad looked at them and then down. "Nothing," he mumbled, defeated. "Then it's settled," announced Grandmom happily. "Holly will go back to Aunt Hilary's this fall, just like last year. I know you're worried, Dillon," she said, looking at him, "but it's for the best. You'll see. And Holly, dear," she added, looking over affectionately at Holly, "you just come to us if you have any more problems about going to school." "Yes, ma'am," said Holly meekly, while keeping her eyes steadfastly down. "There," proclaimed Grandmom, settling back in her chair. "Everything's all out in the open and taken care of. We're one big happy family again." She and Granddad resumed eating with gusto, failing to notice that Mum and Dad were anything but happy. "You are so busted," whispered Vernon to Holly after dinner. Unknowingly, Grandmom had just gotten Dad to agree to send Holly back to Hogwarts, the very school she hated the most. "Dad's really mad," continued Vernon, remembering that red face he'd seen at the dinner table, looking about ready to blow up. "I know," Holly nodded, still keeping her face down while they helped to clear the dinner table. "But at least I'll be going back to Hogwarts. He won't dare change it now." They were both right. While not a word was said during the rest of the visit, as soon as the parents left for their castle tours, Dad fixed a murderous gaze on Holly and ordered in a thundering voice, "Go to your room and don't come out. Ever." Without a word, Holly went to her room and shut the door. That was the last time Vernon saw Holly. She spent the rest of her summer locked up in her bedroom, even taking meals there. Vernon didn't even talk to Holly about caring for her cat. Not that it really mattered. He pretty much knew the routine. Vernon spent his time keeping out of the way of his parents. Though not the source of their anger, both parents were so snappish that, with Holly always in the bedroom and out of sight, Vernon feared they would take out their anger on him instead. Vernon never heard another word about that fateful dinner conversation with his grandparents, but one day, towards the end of summer, Vernon heard his mum come into Holly's room and tell her to get packed and ready for school. She would be leaving for Hogwarts the next day. On the morning of the departure, nothing could be heard in the Wycliffe kitchen except the clink of dishes and the radio in the background. Even today, Holly ate in her bedroom. 4-year-old Megan Fielding disappeared from her bed early this morning, the radio blared. Vernon ate his food quickly. It was uncomfortable being around his parents. "Be on the lookout for a white station wagon seen in the vicinity of." At 8 a.m. sharp, a soft rap sounded on the door. "I'll get it," said Mum. She hastily wiped off her hands and left the kitchen. A few seconds later, Vernon heard the front door open. "Mr. Potter," he heard Mum say with forced cheerfulness. "It's so good to see you. Won't you come in?" Vernon walked into the living room and saw the tall figure of Cousin Harry standing in the doorway. He was wearing a slightly rumpled light gray suit. Dad was nowhere around. "Not today, I think, Mrs. Wycliffe," replied Cousin Harry quietly. "We need to be going." He probably knew just how unwelcome he was in the house. "Of course," replied Mum. She turned and called out, "Holly, it's time!" "Vernon," she added, seeing him, "would you go get the cat, please?" "Sure," replied Vernon, and left for the garage. When he had returned with Sasha and the carrier, Holly was already at the door with her 2 bags. Her short, curly blonde hair had grown out and was long and straight again. She reached out and grabbed the handle of the carrier, nodding her thanks to Vernon. For a moment, no one spoke and just looked at each other. I'll, get my keys and give you a lift to the station, said Mum finally, looking around for her purse. Thank you, replied Cousin Harry. No, shouted Dad, coming out of his bedroom. I'll do it. Dad faced Cousin Harry angrily, daring him to argue. Cousin Harry's eyes narrowed briefly, but he said nothing, as he backed away from the entrance to let Dad through. Soon the car was loaded up and ready to go. Good day, Mrs. Wycliffe, Vernon, said Cousin Harry evenly, looking at both of them before he turned and got into the car next to Dad. Holly looked at the two of them standing in the entrance. Bye, Vernon, she said softly, giving him a quick hug. Thanks for caring for Sasha, she added. Vernon nodded. I'll write, she whispered in his ear. Bye, sis, he replied, hugging her back. Good luck. Bye, Mum, Holly added, hugging her as well. I promise I'll write. Then Holly got into the auto and closed the door. The auto started up and backed out of the driveway. Then it turned into the street. Vernon and his mum watched as the auto drove down the street, finally vanishing from sight. It felt cold in the car, and not from the temperature. Dylan didn't know whether he was angrier with Harry for having nearly gotten Holly killed last spring, or with Holly for forcing him to send her back to that school. Get rid of it all, he had insisted to Laurel when they had returned from the station with Holly. The necklace, that blue book, everything. I don't want any of it here that has to do with Harry or his kind in my house ever again. But Laurel had refused. That's my necklace from Holly, she said. I won't give it up. And as for that book, we don't even know where they live, Laurel had protested. I won't have you posting signs with our name and number all over King's Cross Station should we need to contact Harry again. There'll be no chance of that, Dylan assured her. I don't even want to see Harry as long as I live. And what about Holly, countered Laurel. You saw how upset she was when you broke the news. What if she gets so desperate she runs off and tries to find the school by herself? How will we find her? How will we get her back? That gave Dylan a start. Harry had gotten angry and ran off a couple times, only to return the next summer after another year at that school. Well, he relented, get that stuff out of my sight. I don't want to see any of it ever again. Dylan hadn't asked Laurel how she knew when Harry was coming to pick up Holly, or how Harry even knew to come get her. Dylan knew, and it rankled him even more to think that Laurel had been right to keep it all. Unable to stand the silence or his thoughts, Dylan turned on the radio and fiddled with the tuner until he got a station that came in clearly. Have found the car believed to have been used in the abduction of 4-year-old Megan Fieldings, the radio announcer said. It was parked on the side of the road with a flat tire. Officials have begun a door-to-door search of the area. Megan Fieldings is about 1 meter tall, with straight, shoulder-length, light brown hair and hazel eyes. She was last seen wearing a pink flannel nightgown and white bunny slippers. If you see anyone matching this description, please contact the authorities at... Dylan shut off the radio. The news made him feel even worse. How could people do things like that? I thought Holly wouldn't be going to Hogwarts this year, commented Harry without emotion. Yeah, well, it seems Holly had other ideas, grumbled Dylan. Oh? They drove in silence for a while, and then... Holly just wouldn't let up, Dylan burst out. She went on and on about going back to that school and wouldn't let up no matter what I said or did, he complained. Never mind that Holly was in the back seat listening to him. Dylan didn't care. It didn't matter anymore. I seem to recall you went to quite a few extremes, never giving up, to get your way with your parents, too, Harry replied mildly. Yeah, well, not like this, protested Dylan. Harry did not respond. They drove on in silence. Finally, Dylan could take it no more. He burst out angrily. She told my parents that she wanted to go back to Aunt Hillary's private finishing school for young ladies. All the rage and frustration he felt at that event could be heard in his voice. Your parents didn't know Holly was attending Hogwarts? No, Dylan blurted. I was going to tell them this summer, but after what happened in the spring and then the way Holly was after we got home, I never got around to it. Dylan took a deep breath and then continued. When Holly told them she wanted to go back to Aunt Hillary's and Mum was sitting there asking why I didn't want her to return when obviously Holly was so much healthier after having attended there, they didn't know a thing about Holly last summer, and I couldn't tell my parents the truth, that I'd lied to them all year and that they were insisting Holly attend the very school they hated the most. I just couldn't, Dylan concluded miserably. Stop the car, please. Dylan continued to drive, too upset to really hear what Harry had said. Dylan, pull over and stop the car, Harry ordered a second time. Dylan ignored Harry, lost in his misery. Stop the car, Dudley, now! The forceful use of his old name shook Dylan from his thoughts. He hastily found a safe place on the side of the road, pulled over, and stopped the car. Then he turned to look at Harry. Holly doesn't have to attend Hogwarts, Dudley, Harry said, his eyes blazing with an anger Dylan hadn't seen in him in ages. We can fix this. We can send somebody to your parents' house and modify their memories. They'll never remember the conversation you had with them this summer, or that they insisted Holly return to Aunt Hillary's. We'll even provide you with transcripts if you want. Then you'll be free to send Holly to the school of your choice. Harry unbuckled his seatbelt and twisted around to fix his green eyes on Holly. What you did, he said to Holly icily, was emotional blackmail, and it was wrong. She practically wilted under his stare. Harry's voice trembled with emotion as he continued. Do you have any idea how much I would have given for someone, anyone, to care for me as much as your father cares for you? And you're willing to give it all up just to attend Hogwarts? Well, Hogwarts isn't worth it. No school is, and I won't be a part of it. With that, Harry opened the car door, got out, and walked off.